It's time for us to check back in with Watermelon Hill and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. And if you'd like to buy this wonderful book, you can pick up a copy at the website watermelonhillbook.com, and I'll put that link in the description below. We never had a tractor on our farm on Watermelon Hill. All the farming was done with horse-drawn implements or by hand with a hoe, so a good team of horses was essential. Nell and Lady were a great team and also good riding horses. They worked well in harness together, but had quite different personalities. Nell was always the one for an inexperienced rider to try, while Lady was much more frisky and loved to run. Once one of my sister-in-laws was riding Nell, and she slipped sideways off her saddle and down under the horse. Instead of getting excited and maybe causing injury, Nell just stopped in her tracks until everything was put right again. I was still young when we finally sold the horses, so I still couldn't ride without supervision, but my older brothers sometimes rode the horses at a gallop without saddles like Indians. We had a pretty complete set of horse-drawn implements. We had a turning plow, but of course you can only plow one furrow at a time, not like gang plows attached to a tractor. When you reached the end of the field and turned around, you had to lift the turning plow up after releasing the latch with your foot and kick the blade over so the other side of the curved part would turn the earth over the same direction as the previous pass. If you didn't do this, you would just end up with a series of ditches across the field. We also had a disc harrow to go over the field after turning it to chop the dirt up finer, and a tiller plow for tilling the crops after they had come up. The plows had handles that you had to guide as the horses pulled them, and the person guiding them walked behind with the horse's reins around his neck and shoulders. The disc harrow, the mowing machine, and the hay rake, on the other hand, had seats to ride on. They weren't the most comfortable seats, but better than walking. The seats were made of metal with no padding and perforated with good-sized holes to let air circulate and water drain through to prevent rust. They were quite a hot seat if they had been setting out in the sun. They were mounted on a flat piece of spring steel that was angled to provide a suspension of sorts, but a little rough. The farm had several hay fields, so the mowing machine and hay rake were essential. The mower had a sickle bar that could be lowered to cut or raised for pulling back and forth to the hay fields. The hay rake was about 10 feet wide with a series of curved tines to pick up the hay. They were lowered to rake the hay, and when they were full, they were raised to drop it. Each pass in the field, the hay was dropped in line with the last pass, so you ended up with long lines of piled up hay. Then the hay was mounded up into stacks so it would shed water if it rained before they had a chance to take it to the barn. Of course, we didn't have a hay baler, and when I was a little boy, we didn't even know anyone who did. The hay had to be loaded into a horse-drawn wagon with pitchforks, hauled to the barn, and unloaded. Back to the horses. Although I said that Lady liked to run, Nell was very calm and they worked well as a team. I witnessed one time when their personalities were thrown aside and they were off in a mindless stampede, and I had a front row seat. I was maybe 6 or 7 at the oldest. The back door of our house faced a hayfield, which curved to the left into an apple orchard which was also planted in hay. I was standing on the back porch watching Dad and my brother Jack load hay onto the wagon in the apple orchard. Dad was tossing the hay up, and Jack was on top of the wagon arranging the hay so it would be a balanced load. Then he would drive the horses forward to get more. During the loading, the horses' reins had fallen down on the wagon tongue between the horses. Jack reached down with his pitchfork to pick them up. So far, so good. But just as he was reaching for the reins, the horses stomped the ground and stirred up a yellow jacket's nest. The yellow jackets came pouring out of the nest and stung the horses, causing them to bolt. When the horses lunged forward, Jack was thrown backward. The pitchfork slipped out of his hand, caught in the tail of one of the horses, and jabbed into her hind leg. Instantly, the horses reared up, whinnied, and took off. Every step they took, the pitchfork stabbed her leg again. This took Dad and Jack totally by surprise, so when the horses took off, Jack went tumbling over backwards off the wagon. Dad jumped on the side of the wagon and was trying to grab the reins to stop the stampeding team when they cut close to an apple tree, brushed him off, and sent him rolling on the ground. Meanwhile, I'm still standing on the back porch taking in all the action while the horses, still pulling the wagon load of hay, came tearing around the orchard, narrowly missing the outhouse, and headed straight for our house at a full gallop. About 15 feet from the end of the house to my right was a peach tree, a large tree for a peach, and very old. The side of the tree facing the hayfield had a partially rotted out depression in the trunk. The horses were running completely wild and were headed directly for the end of the house. One horse went on each side of the peach tree, and the wagon tongue hit dead center in the rotted out part of the trunk. The wagon tongue was, I believe, about 4 by 6 inches, and it was broken by the force of the collision. That had to take a lot of force. The poor horses wrapped around the tree and butted heads with each other. They were somewhat addled by this, but at least they were stopped. They just stood there trembling all over, but after some time to recover, did not seem any the worse for wear after their adventure. Dad mended the wagon tongue by adding a 2x4 on both the top and the bottom, and we still used it for years. From then on, whenever I saw the wagon tongue, I thought of that afternoon. It was better than a movie. Come to think of it, I don't think I had ever been to see a movie at that time. Water dowsing and warts. Even though I grew up in the country where many, if not most people, were superstitious, I was not. I didn't believe in omens, ghosts, divine healing, or much of anything else that the older people did. If it wasn't in my school books, I had serious doubts about it. You might say I had a budding scientific mind. As soon as I read about Darwin's studies, I saw the logic and believed in them. I assumed that my books were much smarter than my parents, and therefore, so was I. Years later, I read a quote by Mark Twain that went something like this. When I was 16 years old, my father was the dumbest, most ignorant man on earth, but by the time I was 21, it was just amazing how much that old man had learned. That is a piece of wisdom everyone should remember. When my own son was in his early 20s and had a family of his own, we were talking one day and he said, "Dad, you know that stuff you told me when I was a teenager? Well, you were right." "What stuff was that?" I asked. He replied, "All of it." Well, I had the same kind of awakening eventually. I still was not superstitious, but I didn't automatically doubt things my parents said. I took them under serious consideration and lots of times decided that they did indeed have some merit. Both Mom and my oldest brother Lawrence had the gift of water dowsing, also known as water witching, but no one else in the family did. Since it didn't work for me, I didn't really believe in it. I tried it many times, but never got so much as a wiggle out of that stick. They would use a slender, flexible forked stick about 2 feet long and hold on to the 2 forks while walking slowly across the area being searched for water. When they crossed an underground stream, the stick would bend downward. They would crisscross the area until they pinpointed the spot with the strongest pull on the stick, and that would be the spot to drill a well. During the years we lived on Watermelon Hill, we had to drill 2 wells, and Mom located the site for both of them. We lived on a hill, but the drillers struck a good stream of water both times. I still didn't really believe, but what puzzled me the most was that my brother had the same ability, and he was by this time well educated and not in the least superstitious. Lawrence had a family and was living in Massachusetts when we first took a trip to visit him. I was 12 and had never been more than 200 miles from home before. My brothers-in-laws and friends loved and respected him, but thought he was a little weird when it came to his supposed ability to find water. When he knew we were coming, he set up an experiment. He had shown everyone a spot in his backyard where he had located water, and when we arrived, he had an audience on hand. He didn't want anyone thinking he had coached Mom as to where he had located water, so right away he had Mom go out into the backyard and start searching. Mom walked back and forth with her forked stick, and to everyone's amazement, she located the exact same spot that Lawrence had. Pretty convincing. But the clincher for me was an experiment that I conducted back home in Kentucky a couple of years later. I had Mom take one side of a forked stick while I held the other. I had no idea if this would have any effect at all or not, because it would do nothing with me alone. But I had enough of a belief by now to at least give it a chance. We walked across the field near our house, and to my shock, the stick actually bent downward. At first I thought Mom was trying to force it down, but I knew I was stronger than she was and tried to keep the stick from going down. I gripped it so hard that the bark twisted off in my hand, but it still went down. Just recently, my son Steve has discovered that he also has the ability. His neighbor was searching for water in his yard and asked Steve if he would care to give it a try. He tried it, and the stick pointed to the same spot as the neighbor had. I still have no clue how or why it works. I know it makes no sense, but I believe that it does work. Dad and Mom always planted crops or vegetables or flowers by the signs of the zodiac as shown in the Farmer's Almanac. I was a non-believer as usual, and I thought their explanations of it were ridiculous, but I didn't dare tell them that. They said you should plant crops that bear underground, such as peanuts or potatoes, when the sign was one way, crops that bear above ground when the sign was another way, and flowers at yet another sign. Supposedly, if you planted beans or peas or such when the signs were where flowers should be planted, they would bloom like crazy but bear very little. If you planted potatoes when the sign said you should plant beans, the plants would grow beautifully but bear very few potatoes. Above ground crops planted when the sign said you should plant underground crops would have a wonderful root system but bear few fruit. I thought it was all a bunch of hogwash when I was young, but as I got older, my parents got smarter again. After all, what are the signs but phases of the moon? That's all they are. In the almanac, they are also shown as parts of the human body, but they are phases of the moon. It is well known these days that the moon exerts strong influences on the earth in ways as diverse as the tides and women's periods. Why should it not have an influence on crops? I don't plant crops anymore and have forgotten which signs to plant them in anyway, but I believe the practice is valid. This next was a little harder to believe, and I don't believe it per se, but wait, and I will explain. Dad liked to tell a story that happened while the family lived in West Virginia about a mule he had with a big wart on its nose. At the same time, Dad himself had some warts on his hand that bothered him. In the surrounding hills lived an old man who had a reputation as a healer or a conjurer of sorts. Dad had heard that the man could remove warts, so when he ran into him one day, Dad asked if it was true. The old man replied, "Oh, I have looked at some from time to time, and they went away." Dad showed the man his warts and those of his mule and asked him to give it a try. Dad said that the man rubbed his hand over the warts and mumbled a few words, then said to go home and forget them. How was he going to do that? He was interested to see if they went away. Dad said he tried to forget about the warts but kept checking on them and saw no changes at all. Finally, one day, he realized that he actually had forgotten about the warts and hadn't checked them in some time. When he looked at his hand, he was astonished to see that his warts were completely gone. There was no sign of them at all. Right away, he went out to the barn to check the mule, and his warts were gone as well. What was the answer? I didn't believe it for a minute. I was sure it was pure superstition and would just listen dutifully to Dad every time he told the story, which was many times. Nothing happened to change my mind until about 1963 while I was in the Army. I had never had warts before, but suddenly developed warts on every scar on my hands. Growing up on a farm, I had quite a collection of scars, everything from a lawnmower blade accident while I was sharpening it, to a long cut on my finger from an axe while I was splitting firewood, to running a motorcycle through a barbed wire fence. Altogether, I had about a dozen of them all over my hands. The warts were so bad that I went to the base hospital and had them burned off. The relief was only temporary, though, as they came right back as soon as the burns healed. They worried me constantly. They didn't hurt, but I was always feeling them and was just irritated that they were there. And I guess I felt a little sorry for myself. I was a young man, and I was afraid the girls would be turned off by my warts. Eventually, though, I guess I got used to them because I forgot about them just like Dad had done. I was shocked when one day I glanced at my hands and noticed that the warts were gone without a trace. Warts are strange things that can be generated by your nervous system like hives. The more you worry about them, the more likely it is that you will continue to have them. Peace of mind and not worrying about them can sometimes cause them to go away. There's no magic, just your mind controlling your body. I believe that faith healing works sometimes because of the faith itself. The human mind can work wonders for the human body, but how do you explain the mule? It's a good place to end right there. He's right. How do you explain the mule? Fascinating to think about the faith healing. I've known many people who told me, similar to what Dale's sharing, the stories from his dad and from others about people who could remove warts. It's something I've thought about a lot. I do believe in faith healing. And all the people that I've ever known that kind of talked about it, whether it was removing the warts, taking fire out of a burn, taking pain away, any of those things. Stopping blood is another one. They all the people I've ever come in contact with, they believe that faith, that healing power comes from God, from the Lord. They believe it in a religious manner. That's how they believe it. Now, I have a video about people removing warts. I'll link to that so you can go if you've never heard of that or you think it's strange. Other ones that come to mind, I also have one about taking the fire out of a burn when someone gets burned, so I'll link to that one. And I even recently did one, you might have seen it, about thrush, people that are able to cure the thrush in a baby's mouth most often. And again, they believe total faith healing. They believe all the healing comes from God, not from them, but through them from God. I like the beginning of the part we read today about those horses. Oh my goodness, what an event that Dale got to witness there on the steps or on the porch, wherever he was at his house when he was a little boy, watching all that happen. And isn't life like that, a series of events? The horses stepped on the nest, but then that caused his brother to lose balance, and the pitchfork tumbling and hitting the horse in the leg, and then getting kind of hung, teetering, where it just kept hitting her. Oh my goodness, causing all that to happen. Such a series of events that happened. Brushing the tree, brushing the father off there as they went by it, and then finally the peach tree stopping the horses. That had to be an amazing sight. I can see why Dale never forgot it. Pap told me lots of stories about, mostly they didn't have horses, they had mules, but told me lots of stories about them. Two that come to mind. One happened, I think, right over here on an old road where Pap showed me. And they were going, that was when there was fields and things up the creek. Today there's nothing like that up through there, but there was at that time houses and fields and different things. And I can't remember exactly, they may have even been going over to Pinhook from this area. I can't remember for sure what the purpose was, but anyway, they were loading a sled, and something happened that spooked the mules, and Pap told me about watching the mules took off with the sled, just as like Dale was saying, at a full gallop, and the sled was bouncing, and they were yelling and screaming and trying to get the horses to stop, and I think they eventually just run till they stopped is what happened that time. Another time with mules happened down in Brasstown. There was Pap called it the island ford, where you would ford the river if you were, in those days, of course, no bridges and no main roads like there is today. So if you were on one side of the river there, right where the Brasstown Creek empties into Hiwassee River, and you needed to get across. You needed a place. There was no bridge. You needed a place to cross, so they called it the Island Ford. He said it was shallow water, and you could pull your breeches legs up and walk through it. People would do that. But this was in the winter time, and it was his uncle Frank, but Frank was in closer age to Pap, like those big families sometimes would happen like that, closer age to to Pap, but he was older. And I don't remember where they were going, but they come down through there. It was in the winter, and it was really cold. One of the bitterest, coldest winters Pap said he could ever remember. And the water was actually froze over. The river was on that ford there. And he said that Frank kind of studied about it, but then he thought, I think if we go across it, the ice will break, and the mule's feet and the wagon and all that'll just, sink down through the ice, and we can go on across. Well, he said that wasn't what happened, and like Dale, it was a sight that he said he'd never forget. And once they started on the ice, it held, and the mules kind of got scared, and once they got scared, they started sliding. And then once they started sliding, he said it was just mayhem. They went crazy. The wagon about turned over. Their legs are going out from under them, and he said it was a real mess. So those are some of the stories he told me that's very similar seems like to what Dale got to witness. Really interesting, the part Dale's describing how they did hay, because they didn't have no tractors and all that, but they didn't even have a way to bale the hay. Today, when I was a girl, it was all square bales. Now today, it's all the big giant round bales. And I live near a cattle farm that often cuts hay, so that's something I've seen my whole life. I can remember the truck going through the field and the boys out there pitching the hay bales onto the truck. Of course, Dale and people like him and Pap can remember when they would rake it up and put it around in a big pile around the pole. I've written about that several times when Pap told me stories on the Blind Pig and the Acorn. Such a drastic difference in that hard work, and at each step how it got easier. And I guess those round bales are easier because they last longer. They're easier to store. Certainly no one can pick them up, though. You have to have the equipment to do that, whereas in Dale and Pap's day, there was no equipment like that. Here in my area in the last 2 or 3 days, I've noticed people cutting their first cutting of hay this summer. So that's kind of what people have been working on this week. Again, it will be those round bales. It won't be the square ones, and it sure won't be when they piled it up around a pole. I like that Dale mentioned the zodiac signs in this part. And I like the part that he said, after all, it is just the moon phases. If you watch all my videos, you've heard me talk about this before. Matt and I try to plant by the signs. This year we're having a really hard time because we've just got so many additional pressures on us from life. But we try to, and we really do think it works. We really think it just helps. We believe in it. But I've had so many people over the years, whether it's on Blind Pig and the Acorn or in a video that I mentioned, when I say that, they say, that's the occult. You don't know, but that's the occult. Well, all the people I've ever known about, ever come in contact with that planted by the signs, they believe, like kind of what Dale was saying, no, it's not the occult. It's that God created the moon, and He created the earth, and how it all works together with the tides and all the things that Dale mentioned there. And then, there's Bible verses. There's a sign, Ecclesiastes, and a place in Genesis that most people like me say, well, no, that's what we believe, and we believe it's goes by the zodiac signs. Of course, man created the zodiac signs. God didn't do that. Man created the calendar and they do all that. And for people probably like Dale's family and my family, they look to those as far as gardening. But when it comes to your horoscopes and predicting the future and stuff like that, they don't do any of that kind of stuff. But just as a guide of telling you what the moon's doing, so you know when to plant. So that I was glad that Dale, again, put down on paper. He's one more person that said, no, this is why his family done that. It doesn't have anything to do with the occult in their mind, at least, or in my mind. But probably my favorite part of this, the part we read today, I love the whole book, of course, but my favorite part was where Dale really talks about how he thought his father and mother, they just didn't know as much as he did while he was in school. And then it even gives kind of the same scenario with him and his son, and how, and that is common as you grow up, then you realize Mom and Dad knew a whole lot more than you thought they did. But I really like how he described all of it. It reminded me of my oldest nephew, Ben. He'd went off to college, and one time he was back, and I don't remember what he was saying, nothing derogatory or anything like that, but whatever he was talking about his mom and daddy. And I remember Pap told him, Ben, you listen to me, and you listen good. There'll come a time when you'll realize your mom and daddy are a whole lot smarter than you thought they were. And of course, I just at the time kind of smiled to myself, like, you know, Pap's giving him some wisdom there, but kind of telling him too he better think twice about whatever it was he's saying. But I guarantee you today, Ben, father of 3, would totally agree with Pap. And he'll likely go through that with his 3 beautiful girls. He'll probably go through the same thing someday. It is something, if you have good parents, and I wish everyone did. I know everyone don't have good parents, but I sure wish they did. But that is like a commonality that we kind of go through. We think it's, I like to say, when I was a teenager, I was so smart and thought I knew everything. And then, like Dale said, when I got to be my early 20s, I began to realize, oh my goodness, I don't know nothing. I know I drove Daddy crazy, Pap crazy, calling him. I'd call him, and we didn't have cell phones then. I'd call him all the time to ask him stuff, even after I was married, but especially in my early 20s, I'd call him. And of course, I asked Granny stuff too. Drive them crazy asking them different things. Corey and Katie asked me a lot today, and I try to never get aggravated at them, because I know they're doing the same thing I did to Pap and Granny, trying to gain that wisdom and get their opinion, because they've been down that road before. That's one thing Pap used to tell me sometimes. He'd say, Tipper, when I was being that teenager, he'd say, Tipper, you ought to always listen to somebody that's done been down that road before. So it's like his way of cautioning me that I should definitely listen to him. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the book as much as I did. Dale's such a great writer, and so wonderful that he put down his family stories and his personal thoughts and experiences. I'm so glad that he did this for his family, but I'm glad he did it for us too, so that we can enjoy it. Please leave a comment and let me know what you liked about this part. And as always, I hope you'll drop back by next Friday, because we've got to see what happens next.